3 days. That's all I was gone. 3 days visiting my sister in Montana, helping her move into a new place, eating bad takeout, and pretending I enjoyed carrying furniture up 2 flights of stairs. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. But when I pulled my truck back onto my property that Sunday afternoon, I honestly thought I had taken a wrong turn. My driveway was gone. Not damaged, not blocked, gone. Replaced by a brand new concrete roadway leading straight into my neighbor's luxury construction site, like my land had never belonged to me in the first place. And 8 months later, that same neighbor was sitting inside a multi-million-dollar mansion with no electricity, no occupancy permit, and no way to finish what he'd started. Now, before anybody starts thinking this is one of those stories where two stubborn neighbors spend years fighting over a fence line, let me explain something. This wasn't really about a driveway. It just looked like it was. The real story was buried underground. I bought my property outside Cedar Ridge, Colorado, back in 2022. Just under 4 acres tucked at the end of a private access road, surrounded by ponderosa pines and enough distance from civilization to make me feel like I could finally hear myself think. After 20 years managing commercial construction projects all over the country, I was burned out. I didn't want luxury. I didn't want a giant house. I wanted quiet. The property wasn't perfect, but it had character. A modest home, a detached workshop, a gravel driveway that curved through the trees before reaching the county road. Most people would have looked at that driveway and seen nothing special. I knew better because before I bought the land, I'd spent weeks reviewing every survey, easement map, and title document I could get my hands on. Underneath that gravel sat a registered utility easement carrying underground electrical infrastructure servicing several neighboring parcels. In simple terms, the driveway wasn't just a driveway. It was part of a much larger system. The first 6 months were peaceful. Then the last undeveloped parcel in the area sold. That's when I met my new neighbor. His name wasn't Victor. Let's call him Damon. Damon arrived in the neighborhood the way some people arrive at parties, loudly and with the assumption that everyone would be impressed. Within weeks, excavators appeared, then steel deliveries, then crews, then architects, then more crews. Before long, there was a full-scale luxury mansion rising out of the hillside overlooking the valley. The kind of place with floor-to-ceiling imported glass, custom stonework, smart home systems, and enough square footage to make 3 normal families feel insecure. The first time we met, Damon pulled into my driveway unannounced in a black SUV that probably cost more than my workshop. He stepped out smiling like we were already friends. "Beautiful property," he said. "Thanks," I replied. "You building a resort over there?" He laughed. "Something like that." At first, things seemed fine. His crew stayed mostly on their side. Construction noise was annoying, sure, but that's life. Then little things started happening. Concrete trucks began cutting across the edge of my driveway instead of making wider turns. Equipment operators started using my gravel shoulder as a staging area. Tire tracks appeared where tire tracks shouldn't have been. One afternoon, I watched a forklift drive across part of my property line like it didn't exist. I took pictures. The next day, I took more. Not because I was looking for a fight, but because years in construction had taught me a simple lesson. Documentation beats memory every single time. About 2 weeks later, I finally caught one of the foremen. "You guys know you're crossing onto my property, right?" I asked. He gave me the kind of smile people use when they already know they're wrong. "Just temporary," he said. "We'll clean it up." Temporary became frequent. Frequent became routine. Eventually, I decided to talk directly to Damon. I found him standing near the foundation one afternoon reviewing plans with an architect. "Got a minute?" I asked. He looked up. "Sure." I pointed toward the driveway. "Your crews have been using my property pretty regularly." He glanced over his shoulder, barely interested. "Construction gets messy." "Messy isn't the issue." "Then what's the issue?" "Permission." For a second, I thought maybe the message landed. Then he shrugged. Actually shrugged. "It's temporary inconvenience," he said. "Once the project's finished, everything goes back to normal." I remember staring at him and realizing something important. Damon wasn't apologizing because he genuinely didn't believe he needed to. In his mind, timelines mattered more than boundaries. Convenience mattered more than ownership. He wasn't being careless. He was being entitled. The next morning, I sent a formal written notice. Professional, polite, documented. I outlined the encroachments, requested immediate compliance, and included photographs. No threats, no drama, just facts. He never responded. Not phone call, not an email, nothing. 3 days later, I left town to help my sister move. Looking back, I've replayed that decision 100 times. Maybe if I'd stayed home, things would have unfolded differently. Maybe not. What I do know is that while I was loading boxes into a rental truck 2 states away, something was happening back on my property. Something deliberate. Something expensive. Something that would eventually cost Damon far more than he ever imagined. Because when I returned home that Sunday afternoon and rounded the final bend toward my driveway, the first thing I noticed wasn't the concrete. It was the absence of gravel. And I saw where it all led, and I felt my stomach drop. For a few seconds, I just sat there with my truck idling, staring through the windshield, trying to convince myself I was looking at somebody else's property. The gravel driveway I'd maintained for years had vanished beneath a continuous stretch of fresh concrete. It started near the county road, crossed directly over my property, and flowed seamlessly into Damon's construction entrance. There were no boundary markers, no visual separation, no indication that 2 different parcels even existed anymore. It looked intentional because it was intentional. Somebody hadn't accidentally crossed a line. Somebody had erased one. I got out and walked the length of it. The concrete was still bright, still clean, still carrying the faint smell of a recent pour. I crouched down near the edge where my survey stakes had been. Gone. Every single one of them. That's when anger hit me. Not the explosive kind, but the cold kind. The dangerous kind. The kind that makes you stop talking and start thinking. About 20 minutes later, I found Damon near the framing structure of the mansion. The house itself was massive now. Steel beams, stone veneer, custom windows already installed on 2 levels. He was standing with a project manager when I walked up. "Where's my driveway?" I asked. Damon looked at me for a second, then glanced toward the concrete as if admiring his own work. "Looks better, doesn't it?" I honestly thought I'd misheard him. "You poured concrete over my property. The gravel base wasn't holding up to heavy equipment. So, your solution was to pave my land?" He spread his hands. "It benefits both of us." That sentence stayed with me for months. Not because it was clever, because it revealed exactly how he thought. In Damon's world, if he believed something improved a situation, permission became optional. Ownership became flexible. Rules became suggestions. "You didn't ask," I said. "You would have said no." The project manager, standing beside him, suddenly became very interested in his clipboard. Damon kept talking. "Look, once construction wraps up, everybody wins." "Everybody?" I asked. "You cover my driveway with concrete while I was out of town. You're overreacting." That was the moment the conversation ended. Not because I was out of arguments. Because I realized arguments were useless. Damon wasn't treating this as a property dispute. He was treating it like a public relations problem. He thought eventually I'd accept some money, maybe a repair offer, and move on. What he didn't know was that the most valuable thing connected to that strip of land wasn't visible from the surface. The next morning, I called an attorney named Rachel Morgan. I'd worked with Rachel years earlier on a commercial easement dispute involving utility corridors. She listened quietly while I explained everything. Then she asked a single question. "What's under the driveway?" I smiled for the first time since returning home. "Exactly." By the end of the week, we'd assembled a team. Rachel handled the legal side. A licensed surveyor named Kevin re-examined the property boundaries, and an electrical compliance consultant named Greg reviewed every utility document connected to the easement. Kevin's report came back first. The encroachment was even worse than I'd expected. At its widest point, the concrete crossed more than 11 feet onto my property. There was no ambiguity, no gray area, no survey interpretation issue. Damon had simply built across land he didn't own. Then Greg called. His voice carried that rare tone professionals get when they've discovered something important. "You need to see this," he said. I drove to his office that afternoon. He spread several documents across a conference table. Temporary power permits, utility applications, service diagrams, construction approvals. Most of it looked routine until he pointed to a section near the bottom of one packet. He doesn't have permanent service authorization. I looked up. What? Temporary construction power? Yes. Permanent résidentiel service? No. How is that possible? Greg leaned back. Because final approval requires documented utility access rights. Suddenly everything clicked. During construction, Damon's project had been operating off temporary power arrangements. Generators supplemented some systems. Temporary feeds handled others. But once the mansion reached completion, the utility company would require formal authorization confirming access through the easement corridor. The same easement corridor sitting beneath my driveway. The same easement corridor he'd illegally modified. The same easement corridor under my control. I remember driving home that evening feeling something strange. Not excitement. Not revenge. Clarity. For weeks I'd felt like Damon had all the leverage. Money. Contractors. Engineers. Schedules. Lawyers. Then I realized he'd built an entire project on a foundation of assumptions. And assumptions are dangerous when paperwork enters the room. Rachel moved quickly. Within days, we filed 2 separate actions. The first addressed the unauthorized modification of an active utility easement. The second notified the Regional Power Authority that third-party access across my property was being challenged, pending legal resolution. The language was precise. We weren't shutting anything down. We weren't making threats. We were simply requiring compliance. That's what made it effective. About 10 days later, the first signs appeared. Utility inspectors requested additional documentation. Then engineering reviews were scheduled, then postponed, then rescheduled. Construction continued, but uncertainty had entered the project. I heard about it through contractors who occasionally stopped by the local diner. In small communities, information travels faster than internet service. One electrician mentioned permit reviews taking longer than expected. Another mentioned utility concerns. Nobody knew the full story yet. Damon certainly wasn't advertising it. A couple weeks later, I spotted him at a gas station. He looked tired, not defeated, just irritated. "You really doing all this over a driveway?" he asked. I looked at him. "No." "Then what?" "Property rights." He laughed. "This is ridiculous." "Maybe. You could have just talked to me." I couldn't help smiling. "I did talk to you." His face tightened. For the first time I saw a crack in the confidence. Not fear. Not yet. Just discomfort. A man beginning to realize events were no longer moving according to his schedule. Then came the letter. The utility company issued a provisional restriction pending easement clarification. Temporary service could continue for limited construction activity, but no permanent upgrades would be approved until ownership and access issues were resolved. That single document changed everything. Suddenly, lenders were asking questions. Project managers were making calls. Subcontractors were requesting revised timelines. Delays started multiplying. A month later, the next blow landed. Temporary service authorization expired and renewal requests stalled under compliance review. Portions of the project lost power entirely. Interior climate systems couldn't operate. Environmental controls for certain materials couldn't be maintained. Testing procedures stopped. Inspection schedules collapsed. The mansion still looked impressive from the outside. Massive windows reflected sunlight across the valley. Stone walls climbed toward the ridgeline. Expensive vehicles came and went. But inside, progress was slowing to a crawl. Then contractors started leaving. First one, then another, then several more. Construction financing is built on momentum. Lose momentum, and everything becomes expensive. Storage fees, labor costs, rescheduling penalties, loan extensions. Every week, without resolution, created another layer of financial pressure. One evening, my friend Mike stopped by my workshop. Mike had lived nearby for years and possessed the unique talent of knowing everyone's business without technically gossiping. He took a sip of coffee and said, "You know they're bleeding money over there, right?" I shrugged. "That's unfortunate." He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. "That's the most polite revenge I've ever seen." The truth was more complicated. I wasn't celebrating, at least not the way people imagine. I wasn't waking up every morning hoping Damon suffered. What bothered me wasn't the concrete. It was the assumption behind it. The belief that ownership became negotiable when somebody had enough money. The belief that consequences could always be solved afterward. Because I'd spent decades watching people bulldoze through smaller people simply because they could. And for once, the paperwork happened to matter more than the budget. By the third month, rumors were spreading throughout the county. The giant mansion on the hill couldn't get permanent power. Nobody knew exactly why. Everybody had a theory. And somewhere in the middle of all that speculation, Damon finally started realizing the problem wasn't going away. The first call came on a Tuesday morning. I was in my workshop rebuilding an old table saw when my phone lit up with a number I recognized immediately. Damon. For a few seconds, I just stared at it ringing. Then I answered. His voice sounded different than it had a few months earlier. The confidence was still there, but now it was carrying weight. Pressure. Fatigue. Can we talk? He asked. Not can we work something out? Not can you help? Just 3 simple words. Can we talk? We met 2 days later at a small restaurant halfway between town and the properties. Damon arrived early. Another surprise. The man who used to make people wait was already sitting at a table when I walked in. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically older exactly. More like somebody carrying a problem he couldn't throw money at. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, he finally got to the point. I'll remove the concrete. I nodded, but didn't say anything. I'll pay for restoration. Still nothing. I'll cover every cost. Then came the number. A large one. Large enough that plenty of people would have accepted it immediately. Damon sat back, waiting for a reaction. What he got instead was silence. Finally, he asked, "What do you want?" I looked out the window for a second before answering. That's the wrong question. He frowned. Then what's the right question? Why did you think you could do it in the first place? For the first time during the entire dispute, Damon didn't have an immediate response. He opened his mouth, stopped, then looked away. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he was annoyed. Maybe he still believed he'd done nothing truly wrong. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the conversation ended without a deal. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to destroy him. But because the legal process was already moving, and for once I wanted the process to reach its conclusion. 5 months after I came home and found my driveway buried under concrete, the final ruling arrived. The decision wasn't particularly dramatic. Court orders rarely are. They're usually just pages of dry language written by people who don't care about anybody's feelings. But those pages carried consequences. Damon was ordered to remove the concrete at his own expense. He was ordered to restore the easement corridor. He was required to correct all encroachments. Most importantly, any future utility access would require proper authorization through established legal channels. In other words, the shortcuts were over. A few weeks later, demolition crews arrived. I'll admit, there was something strangely satisfying about watching jackhammers break apart the very concrete that had caused all the trouble. Day after day, sections disappeared. Trucks hauled debris away. Surveyors returned. Engineers inspected. Restoration crews rebuilt the corridor according to specification. By early spring, my driveway looked almost exactly the way it had before. Fresh gravel. Reinforced base. Propé drainage. If you hadn't known the story, you never would have guessed what happened there. Meanwhile, the mansion stood on the hill waiting. Structurally complete. Architecturally impressive. Functionally useless. The exterior was finished. The landscaping was mostly done. The custom windows reflected sunsets across the valley every evening. But once darkness arrived, the place became a silhouette. No lights. No life. No movement. Just an expensive reminder that some problems can't be solved with momentum. Over the following months, Damon continued working through the approval process. To his credit, he eventually did everything the right way. New applications, revised documentation, compliance reviews, utility agreements. The process moved slowly because legal processes usually do. There's one detail people still ask me about whenever this story comes up. Did I eventually sign the consent documents? The answer is yes. I did, but not immediately. I didn't deny them. I didn't block them forever. I simply allowed the process to move at the same speed it would have moved for anybody else. No special treatment. No sorkuts. No rusing. Some people think that was petty. Maybe they're right. Others think it was justified. Maybe they're right too. That's honestly why I still find this whole situation interesting years later. Because depending on where you stand, I'm either the guy who defended his property rights or the guy who dragged out a dispute longer than necessary. Maybe there's truth in both perspectives. About 8 months after the mansion was technically finished, power finally came online. One evening, I looked across the valley and saw lights glowing through those giant windows for the first time. The house looked beautiful. I'll give Damon that. He built something remarkable. A few weeks later, I happened to see him outside while checking my mailbox. We exchanged a nod. Nothing more. No speeches. No apologies. No dramatic ending. Just two neighbors standing on opposite sides of a road, both a little older and probably a little wiser than when everything started. Looking back now, the strangest part isn't that someone poured concrete over my driveway. Construction disputes happen all the time. Property disagreements happen every day. What stays with me is how easily people convince themselves that ownership only matters when it's their ownership. Damon saw a problem, found a convenient solution, and assumed the consequences could be sorted out later. For a while, he was probably right, until he ran into something he couldn't see. A document, an easement, a signature, a legal boundary hidden beneath the surface. And that's the lesson I took away from all of it. Foundations matter, not just the concrete ones, the legal ones, the ethical ones, the invisible agreements that allow neighbors and communities to coexist without constantly tearing each other apart. Because the moment people start believing those foundations don't apply to them, they're usually standing on ground that isn't really theirs. So now I want to hear what you think. If you came home and found a neighbor had permanently altered your property without permission, would you have done exactly what I did? Would you have accepted the first settlement offer and moved on? Or do you think I took things too far by letting the legal process play out and delaying consent until everything was handled properly? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I can already tell this is one of those stories where people are going to end up on completely opposite sides. And honestly, that's what makes it worth talking about. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates a good property dispute with a twist. Trust me, after everything that happened, I'm still not sure whether this story is about justice, stubbornness, or simply the price people pay when they mistake access for ownership.